This is Paula from Plantland, and this is the next part of our video about seed starting. So what I'm going to talk about now is we're going to assume you've had lots of successful germination. You've got some flats that are just absolutely full of little plants, and you know that you need to possibly transplant them up to a bigger size. Now, if you started something like a tomato in a 6-pack, a pack like this, it's not really going to grow happily to the size it needs to get before you put it out in just this small container. So you need to transplant it into a bigger pot. Now sometimes people think that means you need to put it into a really big pot, but you'll see that when we sell our tomatoes at Plantland, and what I do at home, is we're just putting them into 4-inch plastic pots. That's the size you need to go up to. You don't necessarily have to go to something huge. If you want to continue with peat pots, there are bigger sized peat pots available. This is a 5-inch, which is a little bigger than this. This would be fine too. But generally speaking, unless you really think you're going to hold these tomato plants till sometime well into June, you really don't need to worry about going to a much bigger pot like this. So you've got your little tomato plants, and actually your little seedlings have come up, and you're going to keep maintaining them as little seedlings for quite some time. So if you have them in, we'll say this kind of setup with seedlings in it, each of these full of seedlings. Some of these you're going to want to transplant up to bigger pots. So, well, actually I need to take a step back. It's okay. I need to take a step back. When you've got these little seedlings coming up, you need to take care of these little seedlings. One of the things people wonder about is whether or not they have to be fed. A seed, in order to germinate, has everything it needs in terms of food inside that little seed. The previous year when the seed was being produced, it absorbed all it needed to absorb to be a viable little unit to germinate. So we don't usually feed our tiniest little seedlings. We're just making sure they're staying evenly moist and they're staying warm. Our seedlings, these are some snapdragons we started. And this is one of the hard things for people to get. If we look at here, we're seeing some pretty newly emerged seedlings. Those are the first 2 leaves that come up. And then if we look here, we're seeing that it has 4 leaves. So it's begun to get its what we call true leaves. And then when we look at one like this, gently pull that one up, you'll see those initial 2 leaves in the middle, and you'll see that it has its 4 what we call true leaves around it on the outside. And that's the sign when something's ready to transplant. Now these are still a little tender, but you can see roots in the bottom of that. So you can see it's grown enough root mass to support that top. So that's something you could transplant. These little guys, tiniest guys, you wouldn't want to try and fool around with transplanting. They're not ready to be transplanted yet because they're nowhere near it. It's when a plant reaches this stage, however, where you've started to see its true leaves, that you need to start thinking about feeding it. And we're going to go back to our spray bottle. You can use a watering can that has a really fine rose on it. The end of the watering can that has holes is called the rose. And there are some nice watering cans, professional watering cans, that have interchangeable hoses or roses and have that real fine spray. But the easiest thing for most home gardeners is to just use a spray bottle. And when we talk about food, because of that, we're almost always talking about water-soluble food. This is Jack's. We also have Whitney Farms. We also have Miracle Grow and probably Schultz's and a few other brands of water-soluble fertilizer. This is the kind that turns your water blue. So when you have these tiny seedlings like this, you've got these little guys, you need to start feeding them. Take your spray bottle. this is very important that you not overdo it with feeding them. These kinds of fertilizers, if they're too strong, will just burn and kill all these little gentle, tiny seedlings. So what we typically do with our spray bottle is we put our water in it. Careful if you have a water softener that you're not using water from the water softener, because it has salt in it and that can be very damaging to your little seedlings. So you're using just some tap water that's untreated. City water's fine, by the way. We're not worried about the stuff that's in city water. Plantland's on city water. You're going to fill your bottle, and then you're just going to put a tiny, maybe teaspoon of this into your water bottle. A very dilute mixture. We usually say that you want to start feeding it at about a quarter strength of whatever this says is the dilution strength. So I think this is probably a tablespoon per gallon. So this is about a quart. So 4 quarts in a gallon, right? God, I'm having to think. 4 quarts in a gallon. So if it's a tablespoon per gallon, you'd want to put about a quarter of a tablespoon in this to start feeding your seedlings. And by this time, you're going to probably be taking the cover on and off some. So you may have the cover on at night and you'd be taking it off during the day. So the odds are that this is going to start to dry out some, okay? So you're going to want to be misting at least once a day. Plantland's little seedlings are in a big heated greenhouse. These get misted twice a day. And we keep them very evenly damp. We never ever let that soil dry out because that's very hard on these little seedlings. So feeding for these, water-soluble fertilizer at about a quarter dilution rate in just a spray bottle, and you're spraying. As these get bigger, you're either going to have to think about transplanting them up to here, or there's something that's going to go out in the garden. The onions are a good example of that, where we would plant these pretty early. So these guys could get bigger, but because we were going to put them out earlier than we would something like, for example, these snapdragons, we wouldn't bother transplanting to a bigger size. We'd just let them grow to size in this kind of container. And this is 806, probably 606. 6-pack that we're growing these in. And these were direct sown in here. What we did was to put a little bit of starting mix, or a little bit of potting soil in the bottom of these, and then we put a little bit of starting mix on top for the seeds to go into. That's a good method of sowing something like onions. When we get to the transplanting, well, let's cover one more thing before we do. A lot of times when you have lots of seedlings and things, you may start to get some pests like fungus gnats and some other things. Sticky traps are a really good solution for that, especially these gnat sticks, are something that you can put around the things that you're growing to try and catch all those little insects, those little bugs that could bother them. We usually don't have very many pests and diseases that bother our seedlings and things, but many of us have houses that are full of houseplants. And houseplants tend to have little pests and diseases in them, even the ones that we may not be aware of. And those more than happily, when they discover your seedlings, will just be like, whoo, new food. So if you grow a lot of houseplants, you need to think about things like putting up some of these sticks. You wouldn't really want to use any of the harsher chemicals and things on your vegetable seedlings when you're growing them. Not just for the sense of keeping things organic, but because some of those, especially the ready-to-use ones where you're not mixing it yourself, they're just going to be too harsh on these small seedlings, so we just don't use them. You can use insecticidal soap, but if you use it and purchase the ready-to-use kind of insecticidal soap, you should decant it into another sprayer and again dilute it down to about a quarter. But really the most effective thing to use are the little insect traps. So there aren't really a ton of other diseases that you have to worry about. Occasionally we do have something called dampening off that comes and occurs with our seedlings. Dampening off is a really heartbreaking thing. You'll have really strong, good-looking seedlings, and then suddenly it gets a bad spot in the stem and just, and it's done. If you notice that happening with any of your seedlings, first thing to do is to pull those seedlings and get rid of them, dispose of them. And then you can treat damping off with chamomile tea. You can mix up a batch of chamomile tea, and you don't have to make it particularly strong. If you want to put it in a spray bottle, you can use maybe 2 chamomile tea bags. Be very careful that it's just chamomile. It's not chamomile and orange or chamomile and lemon. You can mix up tea and put it in a spray bottle, and you can spray to treat damping off. You also can spray this preventatively in your house, but again, it's one of those things where if you have a lot of house plants, you probably need to worry more about this, where if you're growing these seedlings where you don't have tons of house plants, you'll be better off. So that should be all you need to know about disease for this. The other thing to know about food is as these grow, as they get bigger, you can increase this dilution rate to up to 50%. Generally speaking, you're not going to get to a point where you're ever using the 100% method until your plants are almost ready to get put out into the garden. So the next thing to talk about is transplanting. We use potting soil for transplanting. Again, you could use garden soil. If you take your garden soil and use it, you should sterilize it. And what that means is you should put it in a low heat oven, something if your oven goes down to 150 or 170, take a pan of your garden soil, spread out on some cookie sheets, put it in the oven, sterilize it for about 30 minutes at those temperatures to get rid of any organisms or pests in it that might be bad. What we really recommend is using potting soil that you purchase. And this is our twofold, which is the potting soil we use. Again, it's actually, despite the fact we call it potting soil, or call it quite often dirt, it's actually a soilless mix. So it's, again, forest product, which is really fine wood chip, peat moss. It's usually a little bit of decomposed organic matter, and then it's perlite or vermiculite mixed in with it. And this is our twofold. We sell all kinds of brands. We sell brands that are organic. We sell locally made Glacier Gold. One of the reasons we like this twofold is it has diatomaceous earth in it, which is a specific mix that's made for plant land. What diatomaceous earth does is keep down fungus gnats and other kinds of pests on the surface. So it's a pest control method that's organic, that's actually in the potting soil that you use. If you're planted in these little guys, the Jiffy pots, you probably don't need to worry so much about transplanting, but you could, if you wanted, fill a container with potting soil and put this in, and then fill and transplant like that. You don't have to, again, worry about getting that out of that. Same thing if you use these little cocoa pots. You can just plant those directly into a plastic pot like that. Remember, again, you're not doing something like cucumbers or corn that presents being transplanted in plastic. We're usually talking tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, big stuff. So these are snapdragons, and some of these are perfectly fine, would be ready to transplant, where they've got their leaves. This one here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 leaves. And it wasn't pulling out, so I'm going to just reach below and squeeze the bottom of that cell. And then it pops right out. That's a plant that's ready to be transplanted into a bigger pot. If this were a tomato, and that's what I had growing at home in a 6-pack or in a cell flat like this would be a plant that's ready to be transplanted to a bigger pot. And we would put it not in starting mix again, but we would put it in potting soil. So this little guy could get transplanted into a bigger pot. And you'll notice I'm not packing that. I'm not doing anything that packs that soil. Just going to make a little hole plop it in. Tamp it down a little bit. Now the soil, the potting soil, is slightly damp. It's not damp enough. So these would all need to be watered individually before you proceed with them. So you're going to be taking these probably, putting them in a flat, and then you're going to water those in very gently. And again, you could try doing it with a spray bottle. It's going to be hard to get it wet enough, farther enough down. So generally speaking, this is where you're going to start to use some kind of watering can that you're going to water these with to get these good and damp. So I'm going to pull that back out and put him back in so that we don't lose him. And then once you have, can you grab a happy frog for me?
Mm-hmm.
Once you've transplanted your plants up to these bigger pots, you can actually start using the kind of fertilizer that we use in the garden. So once these guys have been in their pots for a little bit, maybe a few days, so that we have a sense that they're taking, you actually can take and put about for this size pot, maybe a teaspoon or so of the Happy Frog, which is the organic fertilizer I like to use, into these pots. This is stinky stuff, so if you're growing your seeds in your dining room, you may not like the smell of this then. If you don't, you can continue to use the water soluble. Just remember that you're going to have to use it every time you water. And once you've gotten to a point where you're transplanting up to here, you're going to be using it at full strength. You can go to every other time you water, but every time you water is better. The next thing to talk about with seedlings when they're small is light. Light is one of those things, they're all going to need good light to grow well, and we don't get enough light here in Montana to do a good job of growing all these vegetables in April and March and April when these seedlings are small. So it almost always requires supplemental light. There are light systems. This is one we sell at Plantland. That's a system that has a light that goes up and down, and it's a tubular grow light. When we talk about, when we talk about grow lights, we're always talking about full spectrum light. And you'll see that. Plant lights, they get called, and agro lights. What they are is full spectrum. An incandescent bulb, the old light bulbs we all use, if you think of the rainbow, that was at the red, orange, yellow end of the spectrum. Fluorescent lights are at the green and blue end of the spectrum. Grow lights are specifically something that emit light all along the spectrum, which is what imitates natural sunlight for your plants. So regular light bulbs don't really cut it. You actually need grow lights. And these ones I'm holding up are just regular light bulb sockets. So I need to take one of these home today. I have some ferns that suffered through the winter and that I'm trying to get going again. This is just going to go in a gooseneck lamp that's over my ferns, so they can fit into a standard light fixture. Back before it was so easy to buy so many different kinds of grow lights, we used to do things like just put them into goosenecks, like I still do, and put them on. And this is a compact fluorescent version that's a little more energy efficient, if you like that idea. And again, you'll see it's just a standard socket. So the other thing we sell are grow light tubes that you can put into something like a shop light fixture. Oh, Michelle's shaking her head no.
They don't make them anymore.
They don't make grow light tubes anymore. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I have some grow lights that are going to be very disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure that has something to do with these kind of systems. There's a picture of it there. These kinds of systems have very specific tubes in them that are probably has something to do with energy efficiency, yeah. This little grow light, and I'll talk more about why we need light as soon as I'm done showing the things we use, is just your basic smaller version of a little clamp light, little utility light like the kind you use to keep chicks warm and things like that. This is actually a really nice little setup. The reason you're using these grow lights is, like I said, because of the fact that we don't get enough light, natural light, here in Montana. So the big question people always ask is, how much does the grow light need to be on? Well, it can't be on 24 hours a day. It needs to be on something more like 6 to 8 hours a day, if not 8 to 10 hours a day. So we usually put grow lights on timers. The other thing about grow lights is they need to be closer to the plants when the plants are small, and as the plants grow, they need to come up. Now, if your plants are getting to be in that 10-12 inch height, we probably are getting enough natural sunlight for them if you have them in a sunny location. If you don't have them in a sunny location that's getting 6 to 8 hours of good, strong sunlight a day, you're still going to need to provide that supplemental light. Most of these lights anymore don't create any real heat, so they're not something that's going to add any great deal of heat to your plants. They're something that's just going to give you light. So I hope that's enough on grow lights. I think we're pretty close to, well, the big finish would be, I guess, once you get your plants into these size pots, you're just trying to hold on to them until we get to the point where we're putting them outside. So we'll talk about that in another video. So I hope I'm doing all right. These are the first ones. I have to turn my brain back to gardening. This is Paula from Plantland, and happy gardening.